optimize your resume specifically for Google. So if this is your dream company, that's where you're applying. We've got some hot tips for you directly from recruiters who work there. So stay tuned. Google tip number 1, make sure that you explain your wins in the right context. What do I mean by that? Well, if your resume says something like 1 second place in some kind of school hackathon, you should edit this. And the suggested way to do as per Google is 1 second place out of 20 teams with standout productivity tool. So be very, very specific and contextual about your wins, whether there are a contest like this example, or whether you're talking about your kind of professional accomplishments at previous jobs. If you are using bullet points, make sure that you're very specific on how you did something, and just the context of whether or not it's impressive is very important for Google. Tip number 2, be specific about your wins. So now we've talked about how to do context. Being specific is really important. And this second example is an example from a Google recruiter from a recent interview they did in Inc. So what the resume says is increased server query response time. Suggested Google edit is, all right, no, again. Hey there, today we're going to talk about how to optimize your resume for Google specifically. And the tips I'm going to share are all hot tips from Google recruiters and folks who are hiring managers looking at resumes to decide who gets to interview at Google. So stay tuned. We have a couple of very important tips for your resume in what Google loves to see. Number 1, make sure that you explain your wins in the right context. So if your resume says something like, I won 2nd place in a school hackathon, you have to level that up. Suggested Google edit, if you could read that below, is 1 second place out of 20 teams with standout productivity tool. And this is really, really important here. Make sure that you have context on why was this impressive relative to maybe other hackathons or relative to other things you could have participated with or done. So doing something like 20 teams is really kind of showing this was maybe a very competitive or larger event. And also talking about how you want something is really critical here for Google. Whether you're doing a bullet point on your job performance or on something you did in school, explain your wins in context. Tip number 2, be specific about your wins. Google likes to see the kind of why and the how very clearly explained. So if you have something very kind of plain, like increased server query response time, Google doesn't like that as much as increased server query response time by 40% by restructuring our API, for example. And the reason why the second example works is you're talking about the increase, but you're also talking about how you accomplish the increase. A lot of you, when you do your resumes, I see you end the sentence at the 40% mark, and you never continue telling me how you did that. So the how is really as important as the kind of what the outcome was or what was the ROI. Make sure that both of those are present in the bullet points when you're talking about wins of you or of your team. Tip number 3, frame your achievements. So if you are a member, for instance, of the Statistical Society and you kind of put that on your resume, that is not really going to stand out. It's not going to show you as a competitive candidate. Make sure that you give Google a sense of scale. So if you were selected as one of 500 participants, make sure you really highlight that. Or if this particular Statistics Scholar Society is really like an intensive professional development program, or if the criteria for how you were selected were very, very tough, make sure you highlight that as well. Now here, you might feel very tempted to be really wordy. It is important to still stay really tight with your wording, but you definitely want to be a little bit more descriptive on the why should I care about this when you frame your achievements. And tip number 4 that is somehow labeled as tip number 1, but we're going to let it slide, is make sure that your accomplishments are really highlighted, and accomplishments here are more important than responsibilities, especially when it comes to building a resume that's specific to Google. So if you say something like was responsible for training staff, this is not as impactful as a bullet point as trained and onboarded 20 engineers. Be specific on the type of staff that you trained and the number of people that went for that training. It does seem like a small change, but it has a really, really big impact. So anytime that you talk about responsibilities in your resume, before you submit it to Google, make sure you frame your responsibilities as accomplishments. This video was brought to you by Candor. We do salary negotiation for tech professionals. If you have an offer, reach out. There's